my name is Maisie and I'm going to be your live educator coming to you from the beautiful, sunny and a little bit windy Little Cayman, where we are going to be undertaking our live broadcast today. So for those of you tuning in, I'm aware that some of you may not have even heard of the Central Caribbean Marine Institute before. So the Central Caribbean Marine Institute is based here in the Cayman Islands, and our vision is a world with vibrant oceans and healthy coral reefs. And we're trying to make this a reality by undertaking cutting-edge, impactful research and trying to transform this research into conservation and education initiatives by bridging that gap between research, knowledge, and putting that into action. So for those of you all watching, especially those of you from the Cayman Islands, you will know that we are currently in 24-hour lockdown. Now, I just want to assure everyone that is watching that we are following all of the protocols that have been put in place by the Cayman Islands government. The two staff members involved in this broadcast, myself and our wonderful producer Jack, who is behind the camera right now, we actually live here at our Little Cayman Research Centre. So we're technically working from home, and this is not that bad of a home to have. So please make sure that everyone watching, you do stick to those government protocols, because we are following them as well. Now, we think that in times like this, when the world has gone, it seems, a little bit crazy with this virus pandemic that is sweeping worldwide, we think it is even more important for us to deliver our Reefs Go Live broadcasts so that everyone can still have an interactive learning experience even when we can't be in school and we have to be at home instead. So today, our live broadcast is going to be how do scientists grow corals? And we are going to be learning all about what a coral nursery is, why we grow corals in our coral nursery, and then we're going to be learning about how we clean our coral nursery frames, which is a really, really big job. Now, don't forget, this is an interactive broadcast, as I said before, and we would really like all of you to send in your questions to us. So you'll see that the YouTube chat screen, just to the right of it, there is a comment box. Please do type in all of your questions inside of there, and later on in the broadcast, I'm going to be trying to answer as many of those questions as I possibly can. What would also be great is if everyone in there could give a shout out to where they are actually watching from. We would love to know how many different countries around the world are tuning in to this awesome broadcast and learning about corals here on Little Cayman. So can't wait to get started, guys. So let's get started, for those of you that have not seen our Reefs Go Live episodes before, with a little bit about coral biology. Because I know that there's not coral reefs in every single country in the world. We're very lucky to have them all right here. So what is a coral? Well, a coral is an animal that is really, really closely related to other creatures such as the jellyfish and the anemone. Now, these are all closely related because they all live inside, they're all part of the same phylum called Cnidaria. Now, a phylum is just a big kind of scientific word for grouping a group of organisms together that all have very similar characteristics. So every single creature within Cnidaria, they have these really cool stinging apparatuses that are called nematocysts. Now, nematocysts are really, really epic, and I'm going to tell you all about them right now. So a nematocyst is essentially like a teeny, 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 tiny harpoon. And what happens is that inside the stinging cell, they release this harpoon that comes out, and it actually injects into another creature a toxin. How cool is that? They have these mini tiny harpoons that are injecting toxins into other creatures. Now, this is not to say that it's, going to necessarily really hurt the other creature, but it is used for defense. So a lot of the Cnidaria will be using these stinging cells so that other creatures won't come and eat them. But some Cnidaria will also use them in order to be able to catch their prey items as well. And that's why when you're in the water and perhaps maybe you get stung by a jellyfish, it kind of hurts a little bit because they're actually using their teeny tiny harpoons, their nematocysts, and they are injecting into you, which is why it sometimes hurts. So all Cnidaria have these, and this is all the anemones, all the jellyfish, and lots of other different creatures as well, including corals. So corals have these teeny tiny stinging cells, and we've got to make sure, that's why we don't want to touch them, because one, it will hurt us, and two, it can also be really bad for the coral as well. Now let's go a little bit onto some basic coral biology. I just said that corals are really closely related to jellyfish. So let's think about what a jellyfish looks like, swimming through the water. Now I want you to imagine that we're putting this jellyfish upside down, like this. So its tentacles are in the air and its mouth is in the center. Now these tentacles are where those stinging cells are, those nematocysts, and they're using them to try and find prey in the water and put them into their central mouth. So that is the basic structure of a coral, and these are all teeny tiny little creatures called coral polyps. So there are hundreds and sometimes even thousands of these coral polyps that actually make up the whole coral structure. So for example, I have some skeletons of some corals right here. Now this is a hard coral. So there are two different types of coral. There are hard corals, also known as hermatypic corals, and there are soft corals. Now the hard corals actually are able to extract calcium carbonate to build their skeleton from the seawater. That is pretty cool. We definitely can't extract our skeleton from the air around us. So these are really amazing creatures. So they are extracting out this calcium carbonate, they're building their skeleton, and these little individual coral polyps that I was speaking about earlier are essentially building themselves a really nice little home. If we look closely at this coral that I have right here, we can see all of these little holes inside of it. And these are where the individual coral polyps live inside of the overall coral structure. And these little holes are essentially the houses of the individual polyp, and we call them corallite cups. So lots and lots of different polyps living inside all of these little holes, making up the coral as a whole organism and as a whole structure. So we also have soft corals as well, which I just spoke about, and they actually don't have this really strong calcium carbonate structure. They don't extract this really hard skeleton, but they do still have a little bit sometimes calcium carbonate inside of them. So this is a soft coral here, and we can see that this bends like this because it doesn't have as solid a structure as these hard corals have, but they do still have these same little coral polyps that are making up the whole structure in itself. So that's really cool. Now there are lots and lots of different structures of the hard corals and the soft corals that we were talking about. I have got some lovely examples right here. I'm going to try and balance them and try not to drop them on myself. So we have, for example, a bouldering or a mounding coral. We have one here that is also a bouldering or a mounding coral, but it's a little bit flatter, and we can see this brain pattern on the top here. So this is a brain coral. And we also have, for example, branching corals like this. So we can see that there are lots and lots of different shapes to the hard corals that I have right here. Now these are actually indicating most of the time different species. And there are certain species that we find in the water around here which are actually really endangered. Now one of those is the staghorn coral. And this is the one that we have right here. We can see it's a branching structure. And if we look in our structure right here where all these little spikes are, those are all the little individual corallite cups where those individual polyps are going to be inside. And this is a really endangered coral that we have here, and we've actually been trying to grow it in our coral nursery. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Katie, who's going to explain a little bit more about the staghorn coral, and she's also going to demonstrate cleaning in the coral nursery. Now don't forget, if you have any questions at all, please do type those in the chat box. And when we come back to me live here at the research center, I will try to answer as many of those as I possibly can.
A coral nursery is very similar to your garden at home, except for that our scientists are growing an endangered species of coral, the staghorn coral. We're growing this coral because it's very important to the overall coral reef health, which is right now under attack from climate change and other human impacts that we talk about in other Reefs Go Live.
The coral that we're choosing to grow in our CCMI coral nursery is right here in front of me. These are called staghorn coral. As you can see, we only have one type of coral growing in this nursery, and it's this one called staghorn coral, as I said, or Acropora cervicornis. We choose to grow this species of coral in our coral nursery for a variety of reasons. Now, this is a relatively small nursery structure. We've actually moved it from our deeper coral nursery, which is a little bit farther away, here into shallower water, just for our Reefs Go Live today, because most of these structures are now in about 60 feet of water, which is just not as feasible and easy to host you guys for our Reefs Go Live. So we brought just one structure here full of these corals so that we could show you what it looks like. Now, again, why do we grow this species or this kind of coral? Well, for a number of reasons. This coral is critically endangered. In the 1970s and before, it was one of the most common kinds of coral you saw on all the reef around me. And then in the 1970s to the 2000s, there was a massive die-off, a big disease event all throughout the Caribbean Sea, which killed off about 90% of this species. Now, as you can see, staghorn coral, it's got a lot of branches. So when they get bigger, as you can see some of these down on the bottom, they start to get really complex and they intermix with each other and create this really complex framework that is very important to nursery habitats for juvenile, commercially important fish like groupers or snappers, and then of course all of the charismatic megafauna that we like, you know, eels and occasionally even juvenile nurse sharks. So there's a lot of reasons that we chose this particular coral over another. So what we want to do in our nursery is get rid of the weeds or the bad algae, just like you students at home would get rid of the weeds in your garden. So we can either take our toothbrush or we can take one of these, which is an exfoliating glove that they sell in pharmacies for scrubbing yourself in the shower. However, we also use it to scrub our corals clean. So, just as you would in your garden, let's de-weed this coral nursery. So you just simply clean this monofilament line that we have the coral hanging on. And for any fishermen or fisherwomen in our audience, this is some pretty heavy test fishing line, maybe 400 or 500 pound test you'd use for really large fish like tuna. And we use it to hang our corals from on the nursery because it's very strong. It's not easily breakable. It can withstand a lot of storm damage. That's pretty much it. Now, the metal sleeves grow a different kind of algae, so you can actually scrub the metal sleeves with this metal toothbrush to get that algae off. And if there's any small bits of remaining algae, you can just kind of gently pick them off. Now, you want to try to maintain the least amount of contact with the coral as possible while you're doing this, because remember, this is a live animal. And there you go. That's a pretty clean little nursery area for that coral.
Well, thank you so much for that excellent demonstration, Katie. You did a really, really great job and did a great example of cleaning that coral nursery frame underwater. Now, we definitely want to make sure that we don't have any of that macroalgae growing on our coral nursery frames. Now, why do we want any of this macroalgae growing on our coral nursery frames? Well, actually, this algae can overgrow the coral slightly. It can cause it to block out sunlight, and it can actually cause reduced coral growth rates. And it also makes them a little bit more susceptible to diseases as well. So it's really, really important that we make sure that we take the time to really thoroughly clean our coral nursery. And that is not a small job, I will tell you that. There are so many frames that we actually have out in our coral nursery, and I can actually see our coral nursery. It's just over there, just behind me. I don't think it's in the shot, but it is just right behind us over there in around 60 feet of water or so. And it is a massive job trying to clean it. So we're going to be working really, really hard on that in the future to be able to make sure that that is nice and clean, so we have lots of healthy coral to use in our scientific experiments that we have. Now, we are having some really, really, really great questions that are coming in, and I'm actually going to start answering some of them right now. So just give me one moment. So I've got one question that has come in from John, and John is asking, would you classify corals as a plant or an animal? Now, this is a really excellent question, John. Thank you so much for asking. Now, we would class a coral as an animal. Remember that I said they were really, really closely related to jellyfish, for example. Jellyfish are animals, and a coral is an animal. It's actually an invertebrate. And if you don't know what an invertebrate is, then please do check out our YouTube page, because we did a live underwater broadcast just a couple of weeks ago called Incredible Invertebrates, and you can learn all about them there. So corals, yes, are an animal, but what is really cool about them is that they actually have an algae living inside of their tissues. And this algae is called zooxanthellae. And what is amazing is that this zooxanthellae, just like most algae and plants, undertakes photosynthesis. And when it does this, it's producing lots of sugars, so lots of food. So actually, the coral gets around 90% of its food from the algae. Amazing. So they are still using those stinging cells, they're still using those nematocysts to capture prey, but they're actually getting most of their food from the algae cells that live inside of their tissues. And this is called a symbiotic relationship. So very excellent question, John. Thank you so much for asking, so that we could clarify whether or not they are plants or animals. Now we have another question that has come in from Madeline, who's asking, how does a coral know if you're there? Now that is a great question, Madeline. So corals are very, very simple creatures. It's not like they have eyes and they can see us swimming next to them in the reef, but they are able to respond to different sorts of stimulus. So for example, if I went really close to a coral and I moved my hand like this and generated a current, then the coral, its little tentacles and those coral polyps are actually going to retract into the skeleton. So they are able to respond to things that are around them, but no, they are not able to, for example, see us whilst we are swimming next to them in the reef. But that just makes it even more important and our responsibility to make sure that we're not going too close to them and, for example, maybe accidentally touching them and damaging them. So we really want to make sure we're being nice and careful around them, but they do know that we're there. They can feel us swimming by and stuff like that. Okay, we have some more questions coming in. Oh, great question from Nicole. So what can I do? There is lots of coral that's been recently broken in North Sound in Grand Cayman. Oh, well, that is such a shame, Nicole, and it's so awful to hear that some of the coral is being broken. Just as I was saying in my last point, it's really, really important for us to make sure that we are really careful around corals, because they actually are so important to the environment, and they also grow really slowly as well. So a lot of corals won't even grow as fast as your hair does. So they grow really, really, really slowly, and we need to make sure that we are, taking care of them. And I think Finn was actually asking how long do corals take to grow. That is a great question, Finn. I think I just answered it. So what can you do, Nicole? Well, Nicole, what you can do is you can spread awareness about how cool corals actually are. And you can tell all of your friends and family that we really need to try and protect them. Now, in next week's episode, we are actually going to be talking about some of the threats that coral reefs are going to be facing, and how perhaps we can how we can actually help them. So make sure you tune in next week, and I'll talk about that then. But the main thing you can do right now is just make sure that you tell everyone how amazing coral reefs are, and try and reduce down your environmental impact so that the corals can stay nice and healthy. Okay, we have a great question that is coming in from Kira now, who is actually one of my old students. Hi Kira, it's lovely to hear from you. And she is asking, why do different coral species respond differently to climate change and ocean acidification? That is a great question, Kira. And as I just said in the last point, we are actually going to be talking about some of the really bad threats that coral reefs are facing in next week's episode, which is going to be at 9:30, same time next Friday. But yes, different coral species do respond differently to climate change and to ocean acidification. Partly this is due to their calcification rates, which I see you've asked about. So yes, you are correct. And also some species are just a little bit more adapted to be a little bit more heat tolerant. Some are more resistant to disease, and some are just better able to survive in these changing conditions. And this can sometimes be because of the calcification rate. It can also sometimes be because of the different clays of zooxanthellae that are inside of them, etc. But we'll answer that more next week, so make sure you tune in then. Okay, we've got a great question that's coming in from John as well, who's asking, where do you plant the corals once they have grown? John, you are one step ahead of me, because we are going to be talking about outplanting in a couple of weeks' time. But essentially we plant them all over Little Cayman. So all of the corals that we have in our nursery, they have actually all come from parent colonies that have been around Little Cayman. And we have taken, it was from 10 different corals, and we put them in our coral nursery, and they've obviously grown and grown and grown, and now we have lots and lots of different fragments. So, but they are unique genotypes, unique genes that are found around Little Cayman. So this is where we're going to be outplanting them, and we're outplanting them and putting them out on the reef in various different locations. We're doing lots of different experiments. We're planting some in shallow water, some in deep water. We're planting some really, really close together and some widely dispersed as well, because essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that when we do like a huge outplanting session, what is the most successful method for us to be able to do that, and what's the most successful one where all the corals, hopefully, fingers crossed, are going to be able to survive. So that was a really great question, John. And in 2 weeks' time, we will actually be going through a video on how to outplant coral, and we will be speaking a little bit more about that. So do make sure to tune in then. Okay, we've got a great question that's coming from Dylan, who's asking, how regularly do you clean the frames? Now, this is a great question, Dylan. And in all honesty, we try and clean them as much as we possibly can. Now, because of the lockdown that we actually do have at the moment, we were supposed to be cleaning our coral frames yesterday, but we obviously weren't able to do that. So we're going to be trying to clean them as soon as possible, and as soon as we've been cleared by the government in order to be able to do so. On average, we try and clean our coral nursery frames about once a week. Because even in a week, you can get, sometimes even half a centimetre of algae growth actually on the outside of the frames. So it's really important that we clean them lots and lots. And probably the longest amount of time you can leave it between cleaning is around 1 month. If you leave it any longer than that at all, then what's going to happen is that algae is actually going to start overgrowing on top of the coral, and it's actually going to cause it to become damaged and maybe even diseased. So we need to try and get out there as much as we possibly can to try and clean all of the frames. We've had some really excellent staff members, volunteers and students that have helped us with this in the past. So hopefully when we're back up and running again, maybe you can come and help us clean some of our nursery frames as well. Okay, so I've got a great question here from Dawn, who's asking how many corals are left in the world? That is a really, really great question, Dawn. And it actually depends on where we are in the world. In this Caribbean region where we are right now, there's about 70-ish species of coral. Whereas if we go to the Indo-Pacific region, so near, for example, the Philippines, Malaysia, Australia, etc., there are around 750 species of coral. There's also different species that we're finding in deep water reefs as well, which we've only really just discovered. So there are lots and lots of different species, but here in the Caribbean, as I said, around 70 species of coral. But unfortunately, due to environmental threats, they haven't been completely reduced down yet, but for some species of coral, it's looking like they may become extinct in the near future. So that number from 70 may actually reduce down unless we can try and prevent threats like increased ocean temperature and climate change, etc. So it's really important that we do take the time to try and protect our coral reefs so we're not losing any of those species at all. Okay, I have a great question that's coming in from Katie. What is Katie going to be asking me? Okay, so I'm going to go to Dylan first of all. So Dylan, do corals in deep water rely less on zooxanthellae? That is a great question, Dylan, and you are completely correct. Now, if we think about the different zones in the ocean, we have the photic zone, which is at the top of the ocean, where there is light. And then as soon as we get below, let's probably say around 70 meters max or so, there's basically not going to be very much light in the ocean at all. If we're finding these corals down at really deep depths, then they are not going to be able to rely on that zooxanthellae because there's simply not going to be enough sunlight in order for them to be able to produce the sugars which would keep the corals alive. Kind of like if you had a plant in your garden and then you put it in a shaded place, it's probably not going to do very well. And it's the exact same thing for most of the corals that we're finding around here. So the deep water corals, they actually are relying on different mechanisms in order to be able to get their food. So a lot of the time, they're going to have a much higher dependency on those nematocysts, on those stinging cells, which they are going to be using on the ends of their tentacles to sweep through the water to try and get lots of food and then feeding themselves in their central mouth. So great question, Dylan. Okay, the next question that I have is from Bassanio, and they are asking, when will you let them go? I'm assuming you're speaking about our wonderful corals in our coral nursery. So when will we let them go? Well, essentially, we need to make sure that they are of a good size, so they at least need to be over 10 centimeters or so. So we can't have any teeny tiny little coral fragments we're putting out. And we need to make sure that the corals are nice and healthy. And we also need to make sure that when we're putting them out onto the reef, it's the right time of year. Because when you're taking a coral from a really nice and safe coral nursery environment, so let's think about a coral nursery. The coral is actually being held up above the sand. They've got really, really great water flow around them. There's not really very many predators that are coming along the sand to come and eat them. So it's a really nice, healthy environment for them to go in. It's really, really nice and safe. If you take this coral and then you put it on the reef and you have to handle it, it's going to become pretty stressed. If you do that when, for example, it's the middle of summer and the ocean is already really hot and the corals are stressed about that already, then the stress can actually get way too much and it can actually cause the corals to die. So we really need to make sure we're doing it in the right season. So we're going to try and do all of our outplanting, fingers crossed, before May. And then we need to make sure they're nice and healthy, they don't have any disease on them, etc. So that's when we're going to let them go. But if not, we just keep trimming them, keep making sure they're nice and healthy and keep them down in our coral nursery until we're all good. So now we have a great question that's coming in from Katie. Hi Katie, we miss you here at CCMI. And she is asking, what can we do if we don't live near the ocean? Now that is an excellent question, Katie. And this is one that we get quite a lot because not everyone is lucky enough to live right by the ocean like we do here. Now, if you don't live near the ocean, the best thing that you can do is actually just raise awareness, as I said before, one, about the threats that the ocean is facing, and not even just the ocean, the world as a whole. The terrestrial environment and the ocean environment are under so many different threats, which we will cover, as I said, in next week's lesson. But just to name a few, we have climate change, we've got ocean acidification, we have plastic pollution, we've got coral diseases, coral bleaching. There's lots of threats that are facing our planet. And we really need to make sure that everyone knows about these threats so they can try to live an environmentally friendly life as possible. So, for example, you can reduce down your CO2 emissions. You can try walking to work. You can try cycling to work. That's also great fun as well. Although not so much here when it's so windy. You can try, switching to a more plant-based diet. And those are the ways that you can help the coral reefs around the Cayman Islands, and just share your passion for the marine environment with everyone else, because people can't save an environment if they don't know about it and if they don't care about it. So just share all of your knowledge with everyone, and trying to reduce down your environmental impact is the best way that you can try and help the coral reefs around Little Cayman. Okay, we've got a great question that's come in from Flynn, and Flynn is asking, do you ever plant any of the coral Cayman? That is a great question, Flynn. And we actually don't plant any of our corals on Grand Cayman. The reason being is, as I said before, all of our corals are actually grown from corals that were originally sections were taken from them around Little Cayman. So the genes and the genotypes that we have here in this nursery are Little Cayman distinct. They are only found here on Little Cayman, so we're only going to plant them around Little Cayman. If, for example, we took some of our corals and we took them over to Grand, there is a possibility that we would potentially take a disease over to Grand Cayman, and we would alter the corals that we're actually finding on Grand Cayman as well. So we don't do that. We do keep all of our corals here on Little Cayman. However, there is a coral nursery that is on Grand Cayman, and I know that you'll potentially be able to get involved with that. So, do see if you can find that out and see if you can get involved with some of the coral nurseries that we're finding over there. Okay, so we have a great question from Ava, who's asking, how long do corals stay in the nursery? Ava, that is a great question. I've kind of answered that one already, but corals stay in the nursery until we need them, essentially. We make sure that they stay nice and healthy. If they get too big, then we do prune them down to a slightly smaller size, and then we get ready until, they're nice and healthy and it's the right season for us to outplant them onto the reef. But yeah, our corals are pretty nice, happy and safe in that coral nursery. So we don't need to move them for any purpose of scientific research, then we won't do that. Okay, the next question that we have coming in from B is, how do you make baby corals? How do they mate? That is a really excellent question, B. And the way that we are having all these corals are kind of mating and growing in the coral nursery is actually something called asexual reproduction. So let's go back to my lovely little coral diagram that I have right here. And do you remember earlier I was speaking about the individual coral polyps, the individual animals that live inside each one of these teeny tiny little coral-like cups? Well, as I said, these are all individual animals. And when a coral first develops and grows, there's actually only one coral polyp. Then what happens is they actually clone themselves. So one coral polyp becomes two coral polyps, becomes 3, 4, 5, 6, and they grow and they grow and they grow. So every single individual coral polyp is actually a genetic clone of the first original coral polyp. And this is called asexual reproduction because you don't need to have a male and a female in order to be able to do it. They're just cloning themselves. So that's how all of the corals in our coral nursery grow, the same way that all corals grow. They are slowly but surely cloning themselves and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Now they also do undergo sexual reproduction as well, and they will release their gametes into the water. And this is when we get lots of, different genetic variations, and when there are, different genotypes that are formed. So the main thing though is that asexual reproduction, where they are cloning themselves and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, so we have a question that's coming from Dia, who's saying, how do you feed the baby corals? That is a great question, Dia. Now, we actually don't have to feed the baby corals at all. The reason being is, as I said before, they are actually getting most of their food from the algae that live inside of them. So that zooxanthellae, that's undertaking photosynthesis. So the sunlight is coming down, and then they are producing oxygen, and they are producing sugars. Well, they are actually making most of the food for the corals, and the rest of the food, they're actually using those stinging cells with their tentacles and actively feeding through the water column. So we don't have to do anything at all. They're actually very, very easy to take care of. You just put a coral in the ocean, it's normally happy to go. So we don't have to go down there and feed them, because, that would be a lot of work, I think. Okay, we have a great question that is coming in from John. And John is asking, how do parrotfish help coral growth? Now, that is a very interesting question, John. So we are actually going to cover this in our third lesson that we're going to be doing in a couple of weeks' time, where we're going to be speaking about how corals are really important for the environment. But talking specifically about parrotfish, now, parrotfish are really important at eating lots and lots of different types of algae. And we spoke earlier about how sometimes algae can overgrow those corals, and they can suffocate them and block out the sunlight, and they can reduce down their growth rates. Well, parrotfish are really good at keeping that algae level down. So it's really important that we maintain a healthy parrotfish population, because otherwise there's going to be too much algal overgrowth on the reef, and this can cause the coral reefs to be damaged. And this is what has happened in the past. So we really need to make sure that we're maintaining a really healthy parrotfish population, because that will also help us maintain a healthy coral reef as well. Okay, we have a great question from Dia, who is asking, when you're outplanting the coral, how do you make them stay in place? That is a wonderful question, Dia. Thank you so much for sending that in. Now, the way that we make them stay in place, we actually have several different methods, and we're going to speak about that in our outplanting lesson in a couple of weeks' time. But basically what we do is we get some marine epoxy, which is basically like really strong underwater cement, and we stick the corals onto the reef, and we make sure that they are nice and secure. Sometimes we'll also use a nail as well, so we'll nail into the reef, so we've got a little bit of metal sticking up, and then we will stick our corals there, and then we will zip tie them to that nail. And we're essentially just doing that until the corals grow, and they grow onto the substrate at the bottom and form kind of their own base and hold themselves in place. But yeah, that's how we attach them first of all. And we also have to make sure that we have permission, obviously, from the Department of Environment to be able to do this as well. So for those of you all watching, we do work in conjunction with the Department of Environment. We have a permit in order to be able to do all of this work. So please don't be swimming around and snapping off random bits of coral and trying to grow them at home, then putting them out onto the reef. This is something that we do, scientific research. It's been approved by the Department of Environment. So if you want to help, then make sure that you reach out to us, and we'll see whether or not we can get you helping us with some of our coral nursery work that we have. Okay, so Ava is asking a question. What diseases do corals get, and how does that affect them? Excellent question, Ava. Thank you for sending that in. There are actually quite a few coral diseases that we actually find in the Caribbean. And some coral diseases can only affect certain species of coral. Now, the main disease that we find on the staghorn coral that we actually impacts our coral nursery is we actually get something called white band disease. Now, white band disease, as the name probably suggests, forms a white band that travels along the coral. And this is, a mix of different microbes, and they're basically causing the coral to die. And we actually had a huge outbreak of this in our coral nursery just last year, and we collected lots of data from the disease progression through the coral nursery. but that is just one of the diseases that actually do impact the reef. And there are quite a lot of them, as I said. We have, you know, yellow blotch, black band, lots and lots of different ones. And we actually don't really know very much about coral diseases. But if you see a coral that you think looks maybe a little bit funny, maybe you see like a big white band along it, maybe you see a black band along it, maybe you see dark grey or yellow spots all over the top of it, then please do take a picture and send it in to us. And you can send them into education@reefresearch.org, and I will try to answer what disease it is for you, and then we can talk a little bit more about the different diseases that we actually find on our coral reefs around the Caribbean. Okay, we have a question coming in now from Dylan. And if deep corals rely more on active feeding, do they need to be bigger? That is a very interesting question, Dylan. And it's one that, in all honesty, we don't really know. And a lot of the deep coral reefs that we're kind of finding now, we're only just discovering, and we don't know very much about them at all. It may be that they are slightly bigger. It may be that the polyps are slightly larger, so they can do more active feeding underwater. But that is not something that I think any scientists really know the answer to now. But I will make sure to do some research on that just after this broadcast, and if I find an answer, then I will let you know. Okay, we have one question that is coming in now from Kira, and is there a way to speed up coral growth, like coral fertilizers? That is a really great question, Kira. And there is a way to speed up coral growth, and that is to put our corals in a coral nursery. So we're putting them in this nice, safe environment where they're not facing that many threats. So if we take our staghorn coral here again, in the wild, this grows about 10 to 20 centimeters a year. So not very much, even though it's actually the fastest growing coral that we find here in the Caribbean. If we take something like this coral that we have right here, then this is actually probably only going to grow about half a centimeter each year. So, you know, this one's actually growing relatively fast. But it grows about 10 to 20 centimeters a year. Then in our deep nursery, which is in about 60 feet of water or so, they actually grow about 7 times faster. So they're growing around 70 centimeters a year because they're in that protected environment and they're not kind of facing as many threats as they would do when they're out on the reef. Now, in terms of fertilizers, corals actually survive in really nutrient poor waters, and fertilizers obviously contain lots of nutrients because that's what we use to, you know, grow crops and stuff like that. So we actually put fertilizers in the water, then the corals are actually probably, unfortunately, not going to do very well because there's going to be more algae growth and that's going to grow over the top of the corals. So we don't want to put any fertilizer in the water, but if we keep our corals in a coral nursery, then they will grow a lot faster than they would do naturally in the wild. Okay, we have year 6 coming in from Poland. Thank you so much for your lovely message you just sent through. Thank you so much for joining in and watching us. It's so lovely that we get a nice message that comes through sometimes. Okay, I think that we have actually gone through every single question that has been asked of us so far. If anyone's got any last minute questions to send through, make sure you send them in now. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to talk about our activity sheets, which some of you guys, or most of you guys, probably should have got sent to you by your teachers. Or if you don't have it already, if you go to our CCMI Facebook page, then there is a link to this document. Now, inside of this document, we have a fantastic lesson plan. We've already gone through the lesson, so you don't really need that bit anymore. But there is also a vocabulary test that you can do at home. And there is not one, but there is 2 activity sheets of fun things that you can do. Now, one of those activity sheets is actually building your own coral nursery frame out of random things, essentially, that you find inside of your house. Now, I've actually made one of these. I made this last night. It was very exciting. And please don't judge me. I'm definitely a scientist and I'm not very good at arts and crafts. But you can see that I have made my very own coral nursery frame. And just like you guys at home, I had to hunt for lots of random materials and see what I could build. So I have some wonderful wooden skewers over here. I cut out some beautiful little corals and I've hung them on my coral nursery frame. So you guys, after this, I really want you to try making your own coral nursery frame at home. And then what would be really great would be if you could send in some pictures of the coral nursery frames that you have built. Now you can either email them to me at education@reefresearch.org, or you can take a picture and post it as a comment on our Facebook page. And if you could comment that on the link for this broadcast on that post, then next week when we do our broadcast at 9:30, I'm actually going to show a picture of some of the best ones that we've got back in. So this is like a little bit of friendly competition. See what coral nursery frames you can make at home, and then please send them in and show them to me. Okay, we have a few last minute questions that are coming in. We've got a question from Ava who's asking, can we visit CCMI and take a tour? Yes, of course you can, Ava. We would love for you to come and visit us, but obviously after the 24-hour shutdown period and after this kind of COVID-19 pandemic has ended. So at the moment, all non-essential businesses are closed. We are not open. But after all of this, if you come to Little Cayman, please do come and visit us. We typically do tours every single Friday at 2:30 in the afternoon. So just let us know that you want to come and we can arrange to show you around our amazing facility where you can see all the different research labs that we have and different classrooms as well. So we hope to see you soon. It'll be lovely to have you here. Okay, we have one more question or two more questions coming in. How many different colors can corals be? This is a really excellent question. So corals are a wide variety of colors, but typically we're finding them to be sort of browny, orangey sort of color. We're not really finding any like bright green corals, for example, but they're typically, you know, nice orangey, browny, yellowy sorts of colors underwater. Sometimes when there has been a bleaching incident, then they can actually turn really bright colors, such as, you know, electric blue or like electric purple or pink or stuff like that. But this is actually showing signs of stress. So corals are not the most colorful things underwater, but they are still really, really beautiful. So yeah, those are a variety of the corals that we're seeing. Okay, I've got a great question that's coming in from Nicole, asking if I can speak briefly about the overall health of the coral reefs in the Cayman Islands. So the coral reefs in the Cayman Islands, compared to many other regions in the Caribbean, are actually in very, very good health. We do actually conduct a yearly assessment of the coral reefs around Little Cayman, and every 20 years or so we will actually go and do an assessment of all three islands, and that actually happened a couple of years ago now, where we did a coral reef assessment on Little Cayman, Cayman Brac, on Grand Cayman as well. Now the coral reefs here, as I said, are relatively healthy compared to a lot of areas in the Caribbean, and particularly here on Little Cayman we have some very, very healthy coral reefs, quite simply because we don't have very many people living here. And we don't have that many dive operations on the island. So there's not that many boats that are going out onto the reef every single day. So our normal population is around 200 people. So we're definitely not causing that many threats here. So yes, overall we are healthy here, but we are of course still experiencing some of those global threats. We are still experiencing those increased ocean temperatures, which is causing lots of bleaching. We had a huge bleaching incident which happened just last year. We are experiencing lots of diseases as well. So we do need to make sure that we are keeping our reefs healthy. It's not like we're not facing any threats here, but you know, they are still really good compared to some areas, and we want to keep it that way, which is why we're trying to do all the research that we can to keep our reefs nice and healthy. Okay, I think that we have finally finished with all the questions that we've had coming in today. Oh, we've got one more coming in. If you touch a coral, will it be harmed? If you do touch a coral, then you are going to cause it some damage. You're not going to kill it immediately. You are probably going to impact it though. So if we think about a coral that we have right here, actually if you touch a coral, it actually has this mucus layer that is just over the top. If you touch it, you're going to feel that mucus layer kind of coming off on your fingers. Now this mucus layer over the top of the corals actually protects them. So if you remove it, then what's going to happen is the coral is going to be much more susceptible to things like disease, predation, etc. So we really don't want to be touching corals. And as I said before, corals can't see us. They also definitely don't have legs and can't move around the reef. So when we're going out snorkeling and diving, it's actually really important for us to try and make sure that we're not touching them. And if we accidentally touch them, then obviously we have to try and make sure that we're not doing that in the future. So please don't touch corals. They are very, very, very sensitive, and they're already facing enough threats without us going and touching them everywhere. So please do keep away and just look at how beautiful they are instead. All right, guys, I think that is just coming to the end of our broadcast now. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to send in pictures of your coral frames that you have built at home. And as I said, if you do a really, really cool one, then we'll definitely show some of the best ones in next week's episode. So in next week's episode, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be going back to our coral nursery, and we are going to be talking about how we fragment some of our coral and how we do a few more restoration techniques. We are also going to be talking about some of the key threats that are facing some of our coral reefs as well, and how we can make a difference and try and reduce down those threats. And that broadcast is going to be at the exact same time next week at 9:30 a.m. That's UTC -5. And you will be able to watch that on our YouTube channel. So don't forget to subscribe so you don't forget about it. And we'll also be posting an activity sheet for that broadcast next week on our Facebook page as well. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. It's been an absolute pleasure educating you from the beautiful Little Cayman that we have around here. Please stay safe, stay home, and we will see you next week. Thank you so much for joining us.